So, today we're going to talk about a story that's, well, it's one of the darkest chapters in industrial history. It's a story about a whole city being poisoned, about shocking corporate negligence, and a fight for justice that, believe it or not, is still going on.
Imagine this. You wake up not because the sun's coming up, but because there's just chaos outside. That's exactly what happened on this morning. The people of Bhopal, India, were literally jolted awake by this invisible terror. The streets just filled with people, totally panicked, running, stumbling, trying to get away from something they couldn't even see.
And the scale of this thing, it's just staggering. We're talking about 500,000 people, 500,000 people, exposed to this silent, toxic cloud that just rolled right through the city's most crowded neighborhoods.
And the effect on the human body was immediate and it was violent. You had people coughing so hard they couldn't stand, their eyes were burning like they were on fire, and they had this horrible, agonizing feeling like their chests were being crushed. And the worst part? As they were running, trying to find clean air, every single breath they took was just pulling more of that poison deeper and deeper into their lungs.
Okay, so you get the picture, right? Absolute devastation. In this first part, we're going to trace this poison right back to its source.
So, this was the question on literally everyone's mind. You had terrified residents, totally overwhelmed doctors in the hospitals, and they were all asking the same thing. What was this invisible killer, and where in the world did it come from?
Well, the answer was sitting right on the edge of town, an American-owned pesticide plant run by a company you might have heard of, Union Carbide.
So this invisible killer, it had a name, methyl isocyanate, or MIC for short. Now this stuff is incredibly nasty. It's usually stored as a liquid, but, and this is the scary part, if it mixes with something like water, it triggers this crazy violent reaction. It basically boils and turns into this thick, heavy gas that hugs the ground, and it's absolutely lethal if you breathe it in.
And we're not talking about a small amount here. No. Buried under a thick slab of concrete, the plant was storing a mind-boggling 42 tons of this chemical. All of it packed into one single underground container, Tank E610. So, how did 42 tons of this stuff just escape? How did it all go so horribly wrong? Let's walk through the timeline of that night, minute by critical minute.
This timeline is just, it's chilling. It all kicks off with what seems like a small problem, a manageable one. At 5 past midnight, a worker reports a minor leak. But the supervisor, in a decision that is just unbelievable, he decides they'll deal with it after their tea break. By 12:30 a.m., it's way too late. The pressure gauge on that tank shoots past its maximum reading. Workers can actually feel the ground shaking as the concrete slab above them starts to crack. And the public warning siren, the one meant to save lives, it doesn't go off for another half hour. Long, long after this deadly plume of gas was already drifting over a sleeping city.
And this is the part that's so hard to understand, right? I mean, a huge international company like Union Carbide, they're supposed to have safety systems, multiple layers of them, to prevent exactly this kind of disaster. So what happened? Why didn't they work?
Well, as the investigators started digging, they found out it wasn't just one thing that failed. No, it was a complete, catastrophic breakdown of every single line of defense.
It was literally a cascade of failures, one thing after another. The first safety system, a gas scrubber that was supposed to neutralize the leak, it was turned off, out of service. The second system, a giant flare tower that could have burned off the gas harmlessly, totally useless because a key pipe had been removed for maintenance. And the final last-ditch defense, water hoses to douse the gas, they weren't even long enough to reach the leak. Every single safety system failed.
And when you look at the state of Tank E610 that night, it's just a laundry list of broken rules. The company's own safety protocols were completely ignored. The rules said the tank should never be more than 50% full. Reality, it was over 75% full. The rules required nitrogen pressure to keep the chemical stable. Reality, it had been off for 20 days. And the gauges, the very things meant to warn them of all this danger, everybody knew they were faulty. You see, this wasn't some freak accident. This wasn't bad luck. Investigators came to a very clear conclusion. This was a textbook case of gross negligence, all driven by cost cutting. And the proof is right there. They'd cut about $1 million from the plant's budget, which meant crucial parts like gauges and valves simply weren't being replaced when they broke.
And get this wasn't some out-of-the-blue event. There had been 5 previous gas leaks in the years before the disaster. 5. One of them had already killed a worker. The warning signs were flashing red, and they were just ignored. But the horror of that night didn't just fade away with the gas. Not even close. For the people of Bhopal, the consequences of that single night have stretched on for decades, creating this terrible, painful legacy. So, what was the human cost? The final estimate is just heartbreaking. Over 25,000 people. That's how many are thought to have died because of the gas leak, not just in the immediate chaos, but in the painful months and years that followed. And for those 25,000 lives and the suffering of hundreds of thousands more, what was the price? Union Carbide eventually paid $470 million in a settlement. When you break it down, it amounted to just a few $100s for most of the survivors. It was a fraction of what was needed. And if you're looking for accountability, well, this timeline is just infuriating. The CEO of Union Carbide, a man named Warren Anderson, he was actually arrested. But he was quickly let out on bail, fled the country, and never, ever came back to face trial. Years later, in 2010, 8 local managers were finally convicted of negligence. But their punishment, it was basically a slap on the wrist, minor fine. And believe it or not, the damage is still happening today. The factory was just abandoned. Nobody ever cleaned it up. So for 40 years, toxic chemicals have just been seeping into the soil, contaminating the groundwater, and poisoning a whole new generation of people in Bhopal. The pain is literally ongoing. And all of this brings us to one final, really heavy question. 40 years later, who is truly accountable? When a disaster like this is caused by a whole chain of failures, by deliberate cost-cutting in a culture that just ignored safety, where does the buck really stop? And after all this time, can we honestly say that justice has been served?